The moment he said, "I'm sorry, I don't recognize any of you," the room didn't react the way families usually do. There was no rush toward him, no urgent reassurance, just a pause, long enough for people to understand what this moment might change. He waited quietly, hands folded, watching faces that seemed to be deciding something without him. And in that stillness, one unsettling question began to form. When the man who built everything forgets who he is, what will the people closest to him choose to remember? Or more precisely, what will they choose to take? Because Richard Halstead was about to discover that the people you think love you most might just be waiting for you to get out of the way. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The man sitting in that hospital room was Richard Halstead, a self-made billionaire whose name appeared on hospital wings, university buildings, and charitable foundations across 3 states. At 72, Richard was known not just for his wealth but for control. Control over businesses. Control over family decisions. Control over how love was expressed or withheld. The room he sat in that morning belonged to a private rehabilitation center just outside Boston. One of those places where the wealthy go to recover in comfort and discretion. The people standing around him were not strangers. They were his wife of 45 years, Eleanor. His son, Michael, 43, who now ran the family company. His daughter, Claire, 37, who had quietly distanced herself years ago, building a life in Vermont that had almost nothing to do with the Halstead empire or its expectations. And yet, when he said those words, when he claimed not to recognize them, no one moved with the urgency you'd expect. Doctors explained that Richard had suffered a moderate stroke 3 days earlier. Memory loss was possible. Temporary, maybe permanent. No one could say for sure. The neurologist spoke in careful, measured tones about neural pathways and cognitive function, about rehabilitation protocols and realistic expectations. He showed them brain scans, pointed to areas of concern, explained that stroke-related amnesia could manifest in unpredictable ways. Some patients lost recent memories but retained older ones. Others experienced confusion that cleared gradually over weeks or months. Richard's case, he explained, involved significant disorientation and retrograde amnesia, an inability to recall personal history, to recognize faces, to place himself within the context of his own life. It was serious but not unprecedented. With time and therapy, some function might return. But what they didn't know, what no one in that room could have imagined, was that Richard's memory loss was not entirely real. The stroke had been genuine, frightening in its sudden onset, the left side of his body going numb, his speech slurring, the terrifying confusion of not knowing what was happening to him. But his cognitive function had returned within 48 hours, much faster than the doctors expected. He knew exactly who everyone was. He remembered his life, his business, his family history. He remembered everything. And when he'd first woken up truly cognizant, seeing the faces of his family hovering over him with expressions that seemed more calculating than concerned, he'd made a split-second decision that would change everything. He pretended the confusion remained. He didn't plan it. It happened instinctively, born from exhaustion and a terrible curiosity. He just wanted to see what would happen if he stepped out of his role. What he would witness in the coming weeks would break his heart in ways he never imagined possible. That first night after the diagnosis, Richard lay in his hospital bed with his eyes closed, supposedly sleeping, when he heard Eleanor and Michael talking in the hallway just outside his room. Their voices were low, but the door was slightly ajar, and their words carried clearly in the quiet of the late evening. "We need to be realistic about this," Michael was saying, his tone businesslike, efficient. "Even if he makes some physical recovery, the doctors say the memory issues could be permanent. We need to start making plans." Eleanor's voice was tired, resigned. "What kind of plans?" Michael didn't hesitate. "Legal plans, Mom. Financial plans. Dad's worth over $300 million. If he stays like this, someone needs to manage everything. The business, the investments, the properties. All of it." There was a pause, and then Eleanor said something that made Richard's chest tighten. "I know this sounds terrible, but part of me is relieved." Her voice was quiet, almost ashamed, but clear. I've spent 45 years managing my life around Richard's needs, his schedule, his preferences. And now, for the first time, I don't have to. He can't tell me what to do. He can't criticize my choices. He can't make me feel small. She paused. Is that awful? Is that an awful thing to feel about your husband who just had a stroke? Michael's response was quick, reassuring. No, Mom. It's honest. And between you and me, I feel the same way. He's been controlling everything for my entire life. Every business decision, every personal choice, always second-guessing, always finding ways I could have done better. And now he can't. For the first time in 43 years, I can just lead without his shadow over me. Richard lay perfectly still, his heart hammering in his chest, tears pressing behind his closed eyelids. This was within 48 hours of his stroke. Not months later, not after a long, difficult caregiving period. 48 hours. And his wife was relieved. His son was liberated. The conversation continued. So what do we do? Eleanor asked. Michael's voice became more focused, more strategic. We talk to his attorney tomorrow. Get power of attorney formalized. Start the conservatorship process. It's not complicated if we move quickly. The medical documentation is clear. Once that's in place, I can restructure the business the way it should have been run years ago. And Mom, you can finally live your own life. Sell that massive house if you want. Move somewhere you actually like. Do things that make you happy instead of things that make Dad's life run smoothly. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice carried something Richard had never heard before. Hope, do you really think we could sell the house? He always said he'd never leave it. Michael's response was dismissive. He's not in a position to make that decision anymore, Mom. You are. Or you will be once the conservatorship goes through. That house is worth $4 million. You could get something smaller, keep the money, finally have financial independence. You've earned it after all these years. Richard heard their footsteps moving away down the hallway, their voices fading, and he opened his eyes in the darkness of his room. He stared at the ceiling, processing what he'd just heard. Relief. Liberation. They weren't devastated by his condition. They were planning how to benefit from it. Within 2 days of his stroke, they were already discussing how to dismantle his life and divide his assets. The next morning, Michael visited alone. He pulled a chair close to Richard's bed and spoke in that slow, overly clear way people use with children or those they think can't understand. Dad, I want you to know that everything's going to be fine. I'm handling all the business matters. You don't need to worry about anything. He patted Richard's hand, and there was something in his expression, satisfaction, perhaps even pleasure, that Richard had never seen before. The company's in good hands. Actually, I've already started making some changes you would have fought me on before. But they're the right changes, Dad. The company's going to be better than ever. You'll see. Well, you might not see, but it's still true. Michael pulled out his phone and started scrolling through emails while sitting beside Richard's bed. He wasn't there to connect or comfort. He was there out of obligation, checking a box on his daily task list. After about 20 minutes, his phone rang. Michael glanced at Richard, checking if he was aware enough to understand, then answered. Hey, Jennifer. Yeah, I'm at the center with Dad now. A pause. No, nothing's changed. He's just sitting there, same as yesterday. Doctors say it's likely permanent. Another pause and then Michael laughed. Actually laughed. I know, right? I mean, it's terrible, obviously. But between you and me, running the business without his constant interference has been incredible. I closed the Henderson deal yesterday, the one he kept blocking because he thought the terms weren't good enough. Made $2 million on it. $2 million he would have left on the table because of his outdated thinking. Richard sat motionless, watching his son celebrate business victories made possible by his father's incapacitation. Michael continued talking to his wife, his voice casual, unburdened. Mom's selling the house. She didn't say it directly yet, but I can tell she's going to. She's already looking at condos in the city. Honestly, it's probably good for her. She's been trapped in that marriage for decades. He lowered his voice slightly. Look, I know I sound callous, But you know how it was with Dad. Nothing was ever good enough. I was never good enough. And now I finally get to prove what I can do without him tearing down every decision I make. Is that wrong? Maybe. But it's also honest. He laughed again. All right, I'll see you tonight. Love you too. He ended the call and slipped the phone back in his pocket, seemingly without any guilt about the conversation Richard had just not understood. That afternoon, Eleanor visited with her friend Patricia, a woman Richard had met at countless charity events over the years. They sat in the small sitting area attached to his room, speaking in what they thought were low voices, but Richard could hear every word. "How are you holding up?" Patricia asked. Eleanor sighed deeply. "It's strange. I know I should be devastated, but mostly I feel free." "Is that terrible?" Patricia took Eleanor's hand. "You're allowed to feel what you feel, Eleanor. You've been in a difficult marriage for a long time." Eleanor nodded. "Difficult doesn't even begin to cover it. Richard was never cruel, never abusive. But he was never really there either. Not emotionally. For 45 years, I've been the woman behind the great man, making sure his life runs smoothly, hosting his events, managing his household. And he never once asked what I wanted, what I needed, what would make me happy." Eleanor continued, her voice growing stronger. "Last night, I looked at apartments online. Can you believe that? My husband had a stroke a week ago, and I'm looking at places to live without him." She laughed, but it was bitter. "You know what the worst part is? I'm excited. I found this beautiful 2-bedroom in the North End with a view of the harbor. I could have my own space, my own life. No more dinner parties for his business associates. No more dressing a certain way, speaking a certain way, being a certain way because it reflects on him." Patricia squeezed her hand. "You deserve that, Eleanor. You deserve to be yourself." Eleanor's voice dropped to almost a whisper, but Richard heard it clearly. "Sometimes I hope he doesn't recover. Is that evil? I hope he stays exactly like this, physically present but mentally absent. Because this way I don't have to leave him. I'm not the wife who abandoned her sick husband, but I still get to live." Richard felt something break inside his chest. His wife was hoping he'd stay impaired, actively hoping for his continued incapacitation because it gave her freedom without guilt. He wanted to sit up, to shout, to make her see him. But he remained motionless, maintaining his performance, watching his 45-year marriage revealed as a prison his wife was celebrating her release from. How had he not known? How had he been so blind to her unhappiness? The answer came quickly, uncomfortably, because he'd never asked. He'd never cared to look beneath the surface of their efficient partnership to see if his partner was actually happy. Eleanor and Patricia stayed for another hour, discussing practical matters. Lawyers to call, papers to sign, plans to make, and Richard listened to every word, each one another nail in the coffin of his previous understanding of his life. That evening, Claire visited. She came alone, carrying a small bag with some of Richard's favorite snacks that he supposedly wouldn't remember liking. She pulled a chair close and sat beside him, taking his hand in both of hers. "Dad," she said softly, "I don't know if you can understand me, but I need to talk to you anyway." Her voice was thick with emotion, and Richard could see tears in her eyes. "I know we weren't close. I know I disappointed you by not being the daughter you wanted. But you're still my father. And seeing you like this breaks my heart." She wiped her eyes. "Michael called me yesterday. He wanted to tell me about the conservatorship proceedings. He made it sound so practical, so necessary. But Dad, he sounded happy. Like this was an opportunity instead of a tragedy. And Mom," her voice broke, "Mom sounds more alive than I've heard her in years." Claire squeezed Richard's hand. "I don't know what to do with that. Part of me is glad they're finally free of whatever weight they were carrying. But part of me is horrified that your incapacity is what freed them. What does that say about our family? What does that say about the life you built?" She was quiet for a moment, and then she said something that made Richard's tears finally fall. "I'm going to fight them, Dad. Michael doesn't know yet, but I'm going to contest the conservatorship. Not because I want your money, I never cared about that. But because someone should defend you. Someone should see you as a person, not an obstacle that's been conveniently removed. Even if we weren't close, even if you never really knew me, you deserve better than this. You deserve better than a family that celebrates your diminishment. Claire stayed for 3 more hours just sitting with him. She read to him from a book she brought, talked about her garden, her husband, her quiet life in Vermont. She treated him like a human being who mattered, not a problem to be managed. And when she finally left, kissing his forehead gently and promising to return soon, Richard broke. Alone in his room, he wept. Silent tears that he couldn't stop, mourning a family he'd thought he had but apparently never did. His son was celebrating business freedom. His wife was hoping for his permanent impairment. And his daughter, the one he'd dismissed and undervalued, was the only one who saw him as worthy of dignity. The irony was devastating. He'd spent his life prioritizing Michael, investing in his son's development, grooming him to take over. And Michael was relieved he was gone. He'd spent 45 years married to Eleanor, providing everything she could want. And she was hoping he'd stay impaired. Meanwhile, Claire, whom he'd barely paid attention to, was the only one who loved him enough to fight for him. If you're still watching at this point, drop a comment with, "I'm still here." Let's see who's truly following this shocking story. 3 days later, Richard overheard the conversation that would haunt him forever. It was late evening, past normal visiting hours, but Michael had come by with his wife Jennifer and their attorney, Gerald Morrison. They were in the conference room adjacent to Richard's suite, and a nurse had left his door open for air circulation. Their voices carried clearly, and Richard heard every word of what would be the most painful conversation of his life. Gerald was explaining the conservatorship process. Given Richard's condition, this is straightforward. We have strong medical documentation. 2 independent evaluations confirm significant cognitive impairment. The court will almost certainly approve. Michael's voice was eager, excited in a way Richard had rarely heard. And once that's approved, I have full authority? Gerald confirmed. Complete authority over all financial and medical decisions. You'd be required to file annual reports with the court, but that's largely a formality. In cases like this, where the conservator is family and clearly acting in good faith, there's minimal oversight. Jennifer spoke up. What about Claire? She's been asking a lot of questions. Michael's response was dismissive, almost contemptuous. Claire doesn't matter. She checked out of this family years ago. She doesn't want anything to do with Dad's money or the business. She said so repeatedly. This doesn't concern her. Gerald made some notes. We should still notify her of the proceedings. It's legally required. Michael sighed, annoyed. Fine, but let's schedule the hearing quickly, before she has time to complicate things. Once it's done, it's done. There was a pause, the sound of papers shuffling, and then Jennifer said something that made Richard's blood run cold. So when this goes through, what happens to Richard? Long term, Gerald answered in his professional, detached tone. That depends on his condition. If he remains at this level of impairment, you'll need to make decisions about his care. Remaining in a facility like this indefinitely is one option. There are also excellent long-term care facilities that specialize in cognitive impairment. Some families choose to arrange home care, though that's quite expensive and logistically complex. Michael spoke, and his tone was casual, as if discussing where to store old furniture. Honestly, a facility makes the most sense. Mom wants to sell the house anyway, and there's no way we could set up proper care there even if she was keeping it. Dad doesn't know where he is regardless. As long as he's safe and comfortable, does it matter if he's in a nursing home? Jennifer agreed. It would actually be easier for everyone. You could visit when you have time, but you wouldn't be responsible for daily care management. And it would be better for your mom too. She could really start fresh without having him in her space. Michael laughed. Actually laughed. Start fresh. That's a nice way of putting it. More like finally escape a marriage that died 20 years ago but nobody had the courage to end. Gerald cautioned. You should be careful how you phrase things like that, especially once you're his conservator. The court wants to see that you're prioritizing his best interests. Michael's tone shifted. became more measured. Of course, Dad's best interest is my only concern. If a care facility provides better round-the-clock care than we could arrange privately, then that's clearly the best option for him. But the damage was done. Richard had heard the truth beneath the acceptable phrasing. His son was planning to put him in a nursing home not because it was best for Richard, but because it was convenient for everyone else. They were warehousing him, filing him away, so they could live their lives without the burden of his presence. Michael continued, I've actually already looked at a few places. There's one in Connecticut, really nice, beautiful grounds. It's about 90 minutes away, so not too far for occasional visits, but not so close that Mom would feel obligated to go constantly. Jennifer added, I saw the brochure. It's lovely, Michael. Very upscale. And honestly, if he doesn't know who anyone is, it doesn't really matter where he is, right? He's in his own world regardless. The conversation moved on to other matters. Financial restructuring Michael was planning, properties he wanted to sell, investments he wanted to shift. He talked about his father's estate like it was already his, like Richard was already dead and they were just managing the aftermath. The attorney occasionally reminded him to phrase things more carefully, to remember that these decisions needed to appear to be in Richard's best interest. But the underlying truth was clear. Michael was dismantling his father's life and didn't even have the decency to feel conflicted about it. After they left, Richard lay in his bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to cry anymore because he'd cried so much already. A nursing home 90 minutes away. Occasional visits. His son had already picked out the facility where he'd warehouse his father like an inconvenient piece of furniture. How do you process that? How do you sit with the knowledge that your own child views your continued existence as primarily a logistical problem? Richard thought about all the years he'd invested in Michael. The time spent teaching him about business, about strategy, about building something that would last. He'd poured his knowledge, his experience, his legacy into his son. And Michael was repaying him by shopping for the most convenient place to store him while he took everything Richard had built. The next morning, Eleanor came to visit, and she was different. Lighter somehow, more energized than Richard had seen her in years. She was carrying shopping bags and wearing a new outfit, brighter colors than she usually chose. Richard, she said, pulling a chair close but not taking his hand, maintaining physical distance. I don't know if you can understand this, but I need to say it anyway. She took a breath. I bought an apartment. In the city. 2 bedrooms, harbor view, my own space. I'm going to sell the house. I know you loved it. I know you always said you'd never leave. But Richard, that was your dream, not mine. That house was always about what you wanted, how you wanted to live, the image you wanted to project. I'm 67 years old. I don't have many years left to actually live for myself. So I'm taking them. Eleanor continued, her voice growing stronger, more confident. Michael's handling the conservatorship. Claire's upset about it, but she'll come around eventually. And once that's finalized, I can make decisions about your care without needing anyone's permission. She paused, and what she said next shattered something fundamental in Richard's understanding of their marriage. I've already spoken with Gerald about divorce options. It's complicated because of your condition, but there are provisions for when one spouse is incapacitated. I can file on grounds of irretrievable breakdown. It will take some time, but it's doable. She looked at him, and her expression was calm, resolved, without guilt. I'm not doing this to hurt you. I'm doing it to save myself. These are probably the last years of my life where I'm healthy enough to enjoy freedom. I'm not spending them as the caretaker of a husband who never really saw me as a partner anyway. Eleanor stood, gathering her shopping bags. The movers are coming next week to start packing up the house. I'm keeping some furniture, selling most of it. Your office, I'm donating all those awards and plaques to the business school. They can make a display or something. You always cared more about that stuff than I did. She moved toward the door, then turned back. You know what's funny, Richard? I don't even feel guilty. I thought I would. I thought I'd be racked with guilt about leaving you like this. But mostly I just feel relieved. 45 years is a long time to be invisible in your own marriage. Long enough. She left, and Richard heard her humming in the hallway. Humming. His wife was humming cheerfully after telling her supposedly impaired husband that she was selling their home, divorcing him, and donating his life's achievements like they were items for a yard sale. She wasn't even pretending to be sad. She was liberated. That afternoon, Richard's physical therapist, a kind woman named Sarah, worked with him on exercises to strengthen his left side. She chatted casually as they worked, not requiring responses, just filling the silence. "Your family's really something," she said at one point. "I've worked with a lot of stroke patients, and I've never seen a family quite like yours." Richard made a questioning sound, staying in character, and Sarah continued. "Most families are devastated. They're in denial, or they're desperately hopeful, or they're falling apart with grief. But yours, they're all so practical, so efficient, like they're handling a business problem rather than a family tragedy." She paused, adjusting his arm position. "Your daughter's different though, Claire. She comes in and just sits with you for hours. She talks to you like you're really here. She's the only one who treats you like a person instead of a situation to manage." Sarah's observation was kind, but it drove the knife deeper. Even strangers could see it. Even someone who'd known them for only a week could identify that his family was managing his incapacity rather than mourning it. That night, unable to sleep, Richard lay awake processing everything he'd heard over the past 10 days. His son was actively happy about his condition, celebrating the business freedom it provided. His wife was hoping he'd stay impaired because it gave her an exit from their marriage without guilt. They were planning to put him in a facility 90 minutes away where they could visit occasionally without disrupting their newly liberated lives. They were selling his home, dismantling his life, divorcing him, and treating the whole thing as an unfortunate but ultimately convenient development. The only person who seemed to actually care about him as a human being was Claire, and she was the one he'd spent 37 years essentially ignoring. 2 weeks after his stroke, the court hearing was scheduled for the conservatorship petition. Claire had hired an attorney, a man named Marcus Webb who specialized in patient rights. Claire had told Richard about it during one of her visits, explaining that she was going to fight Michael's petition. "I know you probably can't understand this, Dad," she'd said, "but I can't let them do this without at least questioning it. Someone needs to advocate for you. Someone needs to see you as more than an inconvenience." Now, as Richard was wheeled into the courtroom by an attendant, he saw his family assembled. Michael and his attorney on one side, Claire and Marcus on the other, Eleanor sitting in the gallery looking uncomfortable, caught between her children. Judge Margaret Sullivan reviewed the medical documentation carefully before the proceedings began. Michael's attorney presented the case for conservatorship efficiently, submitting psychological evaluations, neurological reports, financial documents showing the complexity of Richard's estate. He emphasized the family's unity, carefully not mentioning Claire's opposition until forced, and their commitment to Richard's welfare. Then Marcus Webb stood to present Claire's contest, and the courtroom temperature shifted. "Your Honor," Marcus began, "I represent Claire Halstead, and we're here to contest this conservatorship petition on multiple grounds. Primarily, we question the rush timeline. Mr. Halstead suffered his stroke just 2 weeks ago. The medical literature is clear that cognitive recovery can continue for months or even years. Yet his family is moving to permanently declare him incompetent with unseemly speed. This isn't protection. This is opportunism." Michael's attorney objected strenuously, but Marcus continued. "Let me be specific about what's actually happening here, Your Honor. Within days of Mr. Halstead's stroke, his son began restructuring business operations, making changes he couldn't make when his father was capable of objecting. His wife began planning to sell their family home, a home Mr. Halstead explicitly stated he never wanted to leave, because it's more convenient for her. They've already selected a long-term care facility 90 minutes away, positioning him where he'd be out of sight and out of mind. These are not the actions of people prioritizing Mr. Halstead's welfare. These are the actions of people who view his incapacity as an opportunity to finally do what they wanted while he could still say no." The courtroom erupted. Michael stood up, his face red with fury. "That is completely out of line. We're trying to protect my father. Judge Sullivan gavelled for order, her expression troubled. She looked at Claire, who sat calmly despite the chaos. Ms. Halstead, these are serious allegations about your own family. Claire stood, her voice steady. Your Honor, I'm not accusing them of being malicious. I'm accusing them of being relieved. And I think my father deserves someone in his corner who sees his continued existence as something other than an obstacle to their happiness. Michael started to respond, but the judge held up her hand. I'm going to appoint a guardian ad litem to investigate these claims. We'll reconvene in 30 days. In the meantime, no major decisions will be made about Mr. Halstead's care or assets. As Richard was wheeled out of the courtroom, he glimpsed Michael's face, twisted with anger and frustration. He saw Eleanor looking distressed, her plans delayed. And he saw Claire, calm and resolved, the only person in his family willing to fight for him, the only person who'd chosen his dignity over their convenience. That night, lying alone in his rehabilitation center room, Richard made a decision. He couldn't continue the pretense. Not because it had been discovered, it hadn't, but because he couldn't bear to hear anymore. Every conversation, every revelation, was another knife wound. He'd learned what he'd needed to learn, seen what his family truly thought of him. They didn't love him. They were relieved by his absence. His wife was celebrating liberation. His son was celebrating opportunity. They'd reduced him from a person to a problem, and his continued impairment was their solution. He couldn't heal from these wounds while still receiving new ones daily. But more than that, Richard realized that continuing the lie was its own form of cruelty. Claire was fighting for him, sacrificing her relationship with her mother and brother to defend a father who'd never defended her. She deserved to know the truth even if Michael and Eleanor didn't. Even if revealing himself would destroy whatever remained of his family, Claire deserved honesty. She'd earned it through her loyalty when she had every reason to walk away. So Richard decided. In 3 days, when the guardian ad litem came to interview him, he would reveal himself. He would tell the truth. And he would face whatever consequences came from his deception. But before that, he had 3 more days to observe, to listen, to understand the full depth of what his family had become. 3 more days to catalog his failures as a father and husband. 3 more days before everything changed forever. The guardian ad litem assigned to his case was named Patricia Hernandez, a retired social worker with 30 years of experience. She met with Richard first, conducting standard assessments, watching his responses carefully. Richard maintained his confused presentation, but he could see her noting inconsistencies, her trained eye catching things others had missed. She met separately with Michael, Eleanor, and Claire over the following days, and Richard imagined what they were each telling her. Michael, efficiently explaining why conservatorship was necessary. Eleanor, carefully balancing her desire for freedom with appropriate concern. And Claire, passionately arguing that something wasn't right about the family's rush to institutionalize their father. Patricia spent hours reviewing medical records, interviewing staff, observing family interactions. She was thorough, perceptive, and Richard suspected she was beginning to doubt the narrative everyone had accepted. On the 3rd day, Patricia came to Richard's room and dismissed the nurse who typically stayed during evaluations. She closed the door, creating privacy they hadn't had before, and sat close to Richard. "Mr. Halstead," she said quietly, "I'm going to be direct with you. I've done this work for a very long time, and something about your case doesn't add up." Richard kept his expression neutral, but his heart raced. Patricia continued, "Your physical recovery has been remarkable. Your basic cognitive functions appear intact. But you present as having complete personal memory loss, can't recognize family, can't recall your history. That's a very specific, relatively rare pattern. Combined with the family dynamics I've observed, and the rushed timeline of the conservatorship petition, I have questions." Patricia leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm. "I can't force you to be honest with me, but I want you to know something. Your daughter Claire is fighting hard for you. She's sacrificing her relationships with her mother and brother because she believes you deserve dignity and protection. If you're aware, if you understand what's happening, she deserves to know that." She deserves to know her fight isn't for someone who's already gone. She paused. I'm going to ask you directly, and I want you to think carefully before answering. Are you as impaired as you appear? Or is there more awareness here than your family believes? Richard stared at her, his mind racing. This was the moment. He could continue the lie or he could end it. Patricia watched his face carefully, waiting. Slowly, deliberately, Richard took a breath and spoke clearly for the first time in weeks. I understand everything. I remember everything. I've been aware since the beginning. Patricia's eyes widened, and she sat back in her chair. Oh, Mr. Halstead, what have you done? Richard's voice was hoarse from disuse. I made a terrible mistake, but I learned something I needed to know. Patricia looked at him with something between pity and disappointment. And what was worth lying to your entire family? What was worth letting your daughter fight this battle thinking you couldn't fight for yourself? Richard felt tears streaming down his face. I learned that they don't love me. My wife is hoping I stay impaired. My son is celebrating my incapacity. They're planning to warehouse me in a nursing home 90 minutes away. I learned the truth about what my life amounted to. Patricia was quiet for a long moment. Mr. Halstead, I need to report this to the court. Your admission invalidates the entire guardianship proceeding. She paused. But before I do that, I need you to understand something. What you did, pretending to be impaired, observing your family in crisis, that was a profound violation of trust. Whatever you learned, however painful it was, you learned it through deception. You put your family through emotional trauma. You let your daughter fight for you while you watched like it was entertainment. That's not just unethical. It's cruel. Richard nodded, accepting her judgment. I know what I did was wrong, but I need them to know the truth. I need them to understand what I heard, what they said, what they were planning. They need to know I was watching. Patricia stood, her expression professional but sad. I'll arrange a family meeting for tomorrow. You can tell them yourself. But Mr. Halstead? I don't think you're going to like how they respond. People don't tend to react well to being tricked, even if their behavior during the trick was less than admirable. She moved to the door, then paused. For what it's worth, I believe your family was wrong to treat your incapacity as an opportunity rather than a tragedy. But you were wrong to test them without their knowledge. This situation has no heroes. Just people who hurt each other, some deliberately and some not. She left, and Richard sat alone with the knowledge that tomorrow, everything would come out. Tomorrow, his family would learn what he'd done. And tomorrow, whatever fragile threads still connected them would almost certainly break forever. That night was the longest of Richard's life. He couldn't sleep, couldn't stop his mind from racing through every conversation he'd overheard, every revelation he'd witnessed. Michael's joy at finally being free to lead without oversight. Eleanor's hope that he'd stay impaired. The nursing home they'd already selected. The divorce papers Eleanor was preparing. The casual way they'd discussed dismantling his life. All of it played on repeat, each memory more painful than the last. But beneath the pain was something else. Guilt. Guilt about what he'd put Claire through. She'd been fighting for him, sacrificing her family relationships, standing alone against Michael and Eleanor. And the whole time he'd been capable of fighting for himself. He'd let her stand in that courtroom, let her hire attorneys, let her be painted as the difficult daughter causing problems. What must she have felt? How had it affected her to be the only one advocating for her father while her family treated her like an obstacle? The morning of the family meeting arrived with terrible inevitability. Patricia arranged for everyone to gather in the rehabilitation center's conference room at 10 a.m. Michael arrived first, looking annoyed at having to rearrange his schedule. Eleanor came next, dressed immaculately as always, her new lighter demeanor evident in her posture. Claire was last, and she looked exhausted, worn down from weeks of fighting. They took seats in the conference room, confusion and tension evident in their body language. Patricia wheeled Richard in herself, positioning him where he could see everyone clearly. The room was silent, heavy with unspoken questions. Why were they here? What was this meeting about? Patricia stood near the door, her expression neutral but watchful. Richard looked at each of them. his wife, his son, his daughter, and prepared to speak words that would change everything. "I need to tell you the truth," Richard began, his voice clear and strong, completely unlike the halting confusion they'd grown accustomed to. Eleanor's hand flew to her mouth. Michael's face went pale, then immediately flushed red. Claire leaned forward, her expression shifting from shock to something harder to read. Richard continued, his voice steady despite his trembling hands. "The stroke was real. The physical symptoms were real. But the memory loss, the confusion, the inability to recognize you, that wasn't real. I've been aware. I've been conscious. I've remembered everything since about 48 hours after the stroke. I chose to keep pretending. I chose to let you believe I was impaired. And I did it because I wanted to see who you really were without my presence controlling everything." The silence that followed was suffocating. No one moved. No one breathed. Richard forced himself to continue. "I heard everything. Every conversation you thought I couldn't understand. Every plan you made thinking I'd never know about it." He looked at Michael. "I heard you tell Jennifer that running the business without my interference has been incredible. I heard you laugh about finally being free of my control. I heard you talking to Gerald about putting me in a nursing home 90 minutes away so you could visit occasionally without disrupting your life. I heard you say your only regret was that you couldn't make these changes sooner, that my stroke was the opportunity you'd been waiting for." Michael's face had gone from red to white, his mouth opening and closing without sound. Richard turned to Eleanor. "I heard you tell Patricia that you hoped I'd stay impaired because it gave you freedom without guilt. I heard you celebrating buying an apartment, planning to sell our home, talking about divorce options. I heard you say the last years of your life shouldn't be spent as a caretaker for a husband who never really saw you as a partner. I heard you humming in the hallway after telling me all of this, happy and liberated. Like 45 years of marriage meant nothing the moment I couldn't control you anymore." Eleanor's face crumpled, tears streaming down her cheeks, but Richard couldn't stop now. "I heard you discuss me like I was furniture to be stored somewhere convenient. I heard you talk about my awards and achievements like they were junk to be donated. I heard you planning your new life while I was supposedly sitting right there, unable to understand, unable to object, unable to matter." Richard's voice broke. "And the worst part? You didn't seem conflicted. You didn't seem to struggle with these decisions. You were relieved. Both of you. My incapacity was the best thing that ever happened to you. Within days of my stroke, you were already dividing up my life and celebrating your freedom from me." The tears were flowing freely now, but Richard kept going. "Do you have any idea what that feels like? To hear the people you've spent your life with, the people you thought loved you, actively hoping you'll stay impaired because it's convenient for them." Michael finally found his voice, and it was shaking with rage. "You've been conscious this entire time?" He stood up, his chair scraping loudly. "You let us believe. You watched us go through. You put us through weeks of this and you were aware?" His hands were clenched into fists. "What gave you the right? What made you think it was acceptable to lie to us, to test us, to turn your stroke into some kind of sick experiment?" His voice rose to almost a shout. "I gave up weeks of my life. I rearranged everything to be here, to handle your care, to manage your affairs. And it was all a performance? You were judging us the entire time." Richard met his son's eyes. "I was discovering who you really are when you thought I couldn't see you. And yes, Michael, I heard exactly what you said about me, about your life, about how liberating my impairment was. You weren't grieving. You were celebrating." Michael's face twisted. "Because you've been a controlling tyrant my entire life. You've never let me make a decision without second-guessing it. Never given me credit without finding something to criticize. Never just been proud of me without qualifiers. So yes, finally being able to lead without you tearing apart everything I do felt liberating. Is that what you wanted to hear? That I was relieved? Fine, I was relieved. But that doesn't give you the right to deceive us." Eleanor spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "You heard me say I hoped you'd stay impaired. It wasn't a question." She looked at Richard with devastation in her eyes. "You heard me say that, and you kept pretending, kept lying, kept watching us. Her voice grew stronger, trembling with emotion. Do you have any idea how violated I feel right now? I thought I was speaking to someone who couldn't understand, couldn't judge, couldn't use my words against me. I was finally being honest about feelings I've suppressed for decades. And you were cataloging every word like evidence in a case against me. She stood, backing away from the table. Yes, I was relieved. Yes, I saw your incapacity as an opportunity for freedom. Because Richard, I've been drowning in our marriage for years. You've never asked what I want, what I need, what would make me happy. You just expected me to exist as the perfect wife, supporting your life, facilitating your success, and disappearing into the background whenever you didn't need something. Eleanor's tears were flowing, but her voice was strong now. I'm 67 years old. I don't have decades left. And the thought of spending my remaining years exactly as I've spent the last 45 was unbearable. So yes, when you couldn't control me anymore, I felt free. And I'm not going to apologize for that, Richard. I'm not going to apologize for finally putting myself first after a lifetime of making myself small for you. She moved to the door, her hand on the handle. But what you did, testing us without our knowledge, lying to us for weeks, turning your illness into a trap, that's unforgivable. You want to condemn us for our thoughts and words during what we believed was a genuine crisis? Fine. We're flawed. But at least we were honestly flawed. You were deliberately cruel. Claire had been silent through all of this, watching her father, her mother, her brother. Now she spoke, and her voice was quiet but carried an intensity that made everyone turn to her. I defended you. She said it simply, but the words landed like stones. I stood up in court. I accused Michael and Mom of exploitation. I hired an attorney. I fought against the conservatorship. I sacrificed my relationship with my family to protect you. Her voice began to shake. And the entire time you were fine. You were watching. You were judging whether my defense met your standards. She stood, and Richard could see her hands trembling. I told you things during your supposed impairment that I'd never said before. Private things. Painful things about my childhood, about feeling inadequate, about spending my life trying to earn love that you never gave freely. I said those things because I thought you couldn't hear them, couldn't use them to hurt me. Claire's face was wet with tears, but she kept speaking. I gave you my authentic self, Dad, the most vulnerable parts of me, because I thought it was finally safe. And it turns out you were the least safe person of all. She looked at him with something between pity and disgust. Michael's right to be furious. Mom's right to feel violated. They were responding to what they thought was real. But me? I was fighting for someone who didn't need fighting for. I was the fool who believed in your dignity while you were conducting your experiment. She grabbed her bag, moving toward the door. You wanted to know who we really are? Fine. You know now. We're damaged people who responded badly to a crisis. Congratulations. But you're worse. You're someone who engineered the crisis specifically to see us fail. That's not discovery. That's entrapment. Richard's voice was desperate now. Claire, wait. Please. I need you to understand. But she cut him off. No. You need to understand something, Dad. I forgave you years ago for not being the father I needed. I made peace with our relationship. I built a good life despite your emotional absence. But this? Letting me fight for you while you watched like I was entertainment? That's new damage. That's a betrayal I didn't see coming. She looked at him one last time. I hope whatever you learned was worth it. Because it cost you your family. All of us. She left, and the door closed behind her with terrible finality. Michael followed immediately, not even looking at his father. Eleanor remained for just a moment longer, her face etched with pain and anger. I'm still filing for divorce, Eleanor said quietly. And I'm still selling the house. You asked what we do without your control? Now you'll find out what happens when you don't have us at all. She walked out, and suddenly Richard was alone in the conference room with just Patricia, who looked at him with professional sympathy that somehow felt worse than anger. I need to file my report with the court, Patricia said. The conservatorship proceedings will be dismissed since you're clearly competent. You'll regain full legal control of your affairs. But Mr. Halstead? You have your autonomy back, and you're more alone than you were when I was appointed your guardian. That's the price of your experiment. She gathered her files. I'll see myself out. A nurse will take you back to your room. Richard sat alone in that conference room for a long time after Patricia left. The nurse eventually came to wheel him back to his room, but he barely registered the movement, the hallways, the return to his bed. He lay there staring at the ceiling, replaying the confrontation, seeing the devastation on their faces. He'd thought he was prepared for their anger. He'd known they'd be furious about the deception. But seeing the actual pain he'd caused, hearing his daughter say she'd fought for someone who didn't need fighting for, watching his wife of 45 years walk away without looking back, the reality was so much worse than he'd imagined. He'd wanted truth. He'd gotten it. His family didn't love him the way he'd thought they did. But he'd also revealed that he was willing to violate their trust profoundly to gain that truth. And in doing so, he'd proven that he was exactly as controlling and manipulative as they'd always felt he was. The weeks that followed were devastating in their emptiness. Richard was discharged from the rehabilitation center, his physical recovery complete. He returned home to a house that Eleanor had already mostly emptied. She'd taken her belongings, much of the furniture, all the personal items that suggested she'd ever lived there. What remained felt like a stage set, not a home. Michael refused all contact, blocking Richard's calls, communicating only through attorneys for necessary business matters. The company continued to thrive under Michael's leadership, and Richard received reports but was explicitly told his input wasn't wanted. Eleanor's divorce proceedings moved forward efficiently. She didn't ask for more than her fair share. She just wanted out, wanted to start whatever life remained to her without him in it. Claire responded to one message with a single line. I need time. A lot of time. Maybe forever. Please stop reaching out. Richard tried to work, to re-engage with business interests, but discovered that Michael had restructured everything so completely that Richard's return would undo months of positive changes. The company was performing well. Employees had adapted. His involvement would be disruptive for ego's sake, not business necessity. So Richard sat alone in his empty house, surrounded by wealth and achievements that meant nothing, and tried to process what he'd done. He'd wanted to see his family clearly, to understand them without his controlling presence distorting their behavior. But Patricia had been right. He hadn't seen them clearly. He'd seen them at their worst, in a crisis under false pretenses. And he'd judged them for being human, for being flawed, for responding to stress imperfectly. Meanwhile, he'd been deliberately cruel, manipulative, and controlling in the most profound way possible. The guardian ad litem's final report to the court was scathing in its assessment of the family dynamics. Patricia wrote that while Richard was legally competent and conservatorship was inappropriate, she had serious concerns about the family's ability to function healthily together. She noted Michael's relief at his father's incapacity, Eleanor's hope for continued impairment, and Richard's willingness to deceive everyone to prove they didn't love him adequately. Her conclusion was damning. This is a family where love has become so conditional, so transactional, that no one trusts anyone else enough to be vulnerable. Mr. Halstead's deception destroyed what little trust remained. Whether these relationships can be repaired is questionable. Whether they should be is perhaps the better question. The report became part of public record, and Richard's private family dysfunction was now documented in legal filings that anyone could read. 6 months after his confession, Richard's life had settled into a pattern of isolated routine. He lived alone in the partially empty house, unable to bring himself to buy new furniture because what was the point? He had no family to host, no wife to please with decor choices. He tried to volunteer, to donate money, to somehow make amends through good works, but it all felt hollow. He wasn't doing it from genuine altruism. He was doing it from guilt, trying to buy absolution that wasn't for sale. At night, he'd lie awake replaying conversations he'd overheard, but now with different understanding. Yes, Michael had celebrated freedom from his control, but Michael had also spent 43 years being controlled. Yes, Eleanor had hoped he'd stay impaired, but Eleanor had spent 45 years being dismissed. They'd both been wrong in their responses, but he'd been wrong first and for longer and more fundamentally. The only communication Richard received from his family came through attorneys and terse business emails. Michael sent quarterly reports on the company's performance, fulfilling his legal obligation to keep Richard informed as a major shareholder. But the reports were clinical, impersonal, containing none of the pride or excitement Richard could tell Michael felt about his work. Eleanor's lawyers sent regular updates on the divorce proceedings, which were moving forward with depressing efficiency. She was willing to settle fairly, to divide assets equitably, to end their marriage with legal cleanness if not emotional closure. And Claire sent nothing at all. Not birthday acknowledgments, not holiday cards, nothing. She'd excised him from her life completely, and Richard couldn't blame her. She'd been the only one who fought for him, and he'd betrayed her trust more completely than he'd betrayed anyone else's. 1 year after the stroke, Richard received an unexpected message. Claire had sent a brief email, the first communication in 12 months. Jennifer had a baby, a girl. Her name is Sarah. I thought you should know. Not because you'll be involved, Michael's made it clear you won't be, but because your granddaughter exists. Your legacy isn't just the empire you built and the family you destroyed. It's also this child who will grow up never knowing you. Think about that. Attached was a single photograph of a newborn in a pink blanket, eyes closed, perfect and tiny. Richard stared at that photo for hours. This grandchild he'd never meet. This little girl who would grow up hearing stories about the grandfather who'd betrayed his family. What would Michael tell her about him? What would Claire say when Sarah eventually asked why Grandpa wasn't in their lives? Richard printed the photo and put it in a frame on his desk, the only personal item in his home office besides his computer. He looked at it every day, this symbol of everything he'd lost. He'd gained truth. He now knew exactly how his wife and son felt about him. But the cost of that truth was any future relationship with them, any connection to grandchildren, any possibility of the family he'd once taken for granted. He'd traded authentic relationship for authentic knowledge, and it was the worst trade he'd ever made. His business achievements, his wealth, his name on buildings, all of it meant nothing compared to what he'd lost. He'd sacrificed connection for control, traded love for certainty, and the exchange rate had been devastating. 2 years after his stroke, Eleanor's divorce was finalized. Richard signed the papers in his attorney's office, dividing assets they'd accumulated over 45 years of marriage. Eleanor had been fair, even generous, taking only what she needed to live comfortably. She didn't want to punish him financially. She just wanted to be done with him. The day the divorce became final, Richard returned to his empty house and realized he'd become the thing he'd always secretly feared. Old, wealthy, and utterly alone. He had everything money could buy and nothing that actually mattered. His son wouldn't speak to him. His daughter had written him off. His ex-wife had moved on to a life that by all accounts was happier than the one she'd lived with him. And somewhere in Massachusetts, his granddaughter was learning to walk, learning to talk, becoming a person he'd never know. What haunted Richard most wasn't what his family had said during his pretended impairment. It was what Claire had said at the end. You engineered the crisis specifically to see us fail. That's not discovery. That's entrapment. She was right. He hadn't observed them neutrally. He'd created impossible conditions designed to reveal their flaws, then acted shocked when flaws appeared. He tested them without their knowledge, judged them by standards they didn't know existed, and condemned them for being human under extraordinary stress. And worst of all, he'd done it while claiming to want understanding and connection. But you can't build connection through surveillance. You can't create intimacy through deception. He'd learned the truth about his family, but he'd learned it in a way that made reconciliation impossible. Richard kept the journals, filling pages with reflections that no one would ever read. He wrote about the conversations he'd overheard, but now with different understanding. He could see how Michael's words about liberation were the words of someone who'd been suffocated by control for decades. How Eleanor's hope for his continued impairment was the desperate wish of someone who'd been invisible in her own marriage. How they'd both been wrong to celebrate his incapacity, but he'd been wrong first in creating the conditions that made celebration feel like freedom. He wrote letters to Claire that he never sent, apologizing for betraying her trust, for letting her fight while he watched, for using her loyalty as entertainment. The letters accumulated in a drawer, unsent and probably unreadable, his guilt manifest in ink and paper. 3 years after his stroke, Richard received another brief message from Claire. Michael and Jennifer had another child, a boy this time. They named him Robert, after Jennifer's father. I thought you should know that too. You have 2 grandchildren now who will never know you. Your choice to test us cost you them. I hope it was worth it. There was no photo this time, no softening. Just the bare information delivered like a report. Richard added this to his catalog of losses. Another grandchild he'd never meet. Another relationship destroyed by his need for control and certainty. How many generations would his choice damage? Would Sarah and Robert grow up hearing about the grandfather who'd betrayed his family? Would they be warned against him, taught to see him as a cautionary tale? Richard tried once more to reach out to Claire. He sent a long email apologizing, explaining, begging for just the chance to talk. She responded, "Dad, I've spent 3 years in therapy processing what you did, and I've come to understand something important. I can forgive you. I have forgiven you without reconciling with you. Forgiveness means I'm not carrying the anger anymore. But it doesn't mean I want you in my life. You had decades to be the father I needed. You chose to test me instead of trust me. That choice has consequences. The consequence is that I'm done. Not in anger, just in acceptance. We're not going to have the dramatic reconciliation where everything's forgiven and forgotten. That's not real life. Real life is messy endings and incomplete healing. This is my messy ending with you. I wish you peace. But I wish it from a distance." That was the last communication Richard ever received from his daughter. No more updates about grandchildren. No more brief emails. Just silence that stretched into years. Michael never reached out at all, conducting necessary business through intermediaries and attorneys. Eleanor sent a single Christmas card the first year after the divorce, then stopped. Richard's life became smaller, quieter, lonelier with each passing year. He'd thought wealth and success would insulate him from the consequences of his choices. He'd been catastrophically wrong. Money couldn't buy back trust. Success couldn't undo betrayal. At 79, Richard Halstead died in his sleep, alone in the house he'd once shared with a family that no longer existed. He'd lived 7 years past his stroke, 7 years without a single meaningful conversation with his children, without ever meeting his grandchildren, without anything resembling the connection he'd destroyed in his quest for truth. Richard's funeral was small, sparsely attended. His attorney arranged it according to instructions in his will. A few business associates came out of professional obligation. Patricia Hernandez attended, though she'd had no contact with him for years. Some recipients of his late-career philanthropy sent representatives. But his family didn't come. Eleanor sent flowers with a card that read, "Rest in peace, Richard." Michael sent nothing. Claire sent a letter to Richard's attorney, to be kept with his files. "I'm sorry he's gone. I'm sorry we couldn't find our way back to each other. I'm sorry his last years were lonely. But I'm not sorry I protected myself and my family from further damage. Some wounds are too deep. Some betrayals too complete. Tell him, if it matters, that I meant what I said about forgiveness. I did forgive him, but forgiveness didn't require my presence. I hope he understood that. I hope he found some peace." Richard's estate was divided according to his will. Generous trusts for grandchildren he'd never met. Substantial donations to various causes. Equal distributions to Michael and Claire, despite their vastly different relationships with him. And letters for each of them, final attempts to explain and apologize. Michael's letter was brief. "I know you were right to be angry. I was wrong to do what I did. I tested you in ways that were unfair and cruel. I heard you celebrate my impairment and condemned you for it, but I spent decades giving you reasons to want freedom from me. You deserved better from me. I failed you. I'm sorry." Michael read the letter once, then put it in a drawer and never looked at it again. The apology was too late, too incomplete to matter. Claire's letter was longer, more detailed. "Thank you for fighting for me when you had every reason not to. Thank you for seeing me as worthy of dignity. even though I spent my life teaching you that people were only valuable for what they achieved. You were the only one who defended me, and I repaid you with betrayal. I let you stand in that courtroom, let you sacrifice your relationships with your mother and brother, all while I watched like it was entertainment. That's unforgivable, and I know it. I don't expect forgiveness. I just want you to know that I understood too late what mattered. Connection, presence, vulnerability, all the things you tried to show me that I dismissed. You were right all along. I was blind. I'm sorry I understood too late for it to make any difference to you. Claire read the letter multiple times over the following weeks. She cried while reading it, felt the complicated grief of losing someone she'd already lost years before. But she also felt something else. Anger that he thought a letter could fix what he'd broken, that he expected his late life understanding to be enough. She eventually showed the letter to her husband David, who read it quietly before saying, "He's asking for forgiveness by explaining that he understands now. But understanding doesn't undo harm. It just means he knew what he lost." Claire nodded. David was right. Her father's letters were full of insights that should have come decades earlier, wisdom earned through catastrophic loss. They were proof that he'd grown, but they were also proof that the growth came too late to save anyone. Years later, when Richard's grandchildren, Sarah and Robert and Michael's third child Emma, were old enough to ask about their grandfather, Michael told them simply, "He made choices that hurt people. He valued control more than connection. We weren't in contact when he died." He didn't elaborate, didn't explain the specifics. Let them think what they wanted. Claire was more forthcoming with her daughter when she asked about Grandpa Richard. "He was a complicated man who made a terrible mistake that destroyed our family. He pretended to be sick to test whether we loved him. And when we failed his test, because we're human and flawed, he couldn't forgive us for not being perfect. So we all lost each other." Her daughter asked, "Do you think he was a bad person?" Claire considered carefully. "I think he was a wounded person who wounded others. That doesn't make him evil. It just makes him tragic." The tragedy of Richard Halstead's life wasn't what his family did during his pretended memory loss. Yes, they'd been relieved. Yes, they'd made plans that prioritized their own needs. Yes, they'd celebrated opportunities his incapacity created. But those responses, while imperfect, were understandable from people who'd been controlled, dismissed, and emotionally neglected for decades. The real tragedy was that Richard responded to their imperfect humanity with calculated cruelty. He could have simply stepped back, let go of control, and observed how his family functioned with more autonomy. He could have been vulnerable, admitted his exhaustion, and asked for help. He could have risked authentic connection instead of engineering artificial crisis. But he chose deception, and that choice cost him everything that actually mattered. So here's the final question for you. What would you have done in their place? If you discovered someone you loved had been pretending, testing you, cataloging your worst moments for weeks, could you forgive them? Would you be like Michael, whose anger never healed? Like Eleanor, who forgave from a distance but moved on completely? Or like Claire, who forgave but maintained boundaries that prevented further harm? There's no right answer. Every person in Richard's family responded authentically to profound betrayal. They all had valid reasons for their choices. And they all had to live with consequences of Richard's decision. Consequences they didn't choose but couldn't escape. The family you're part of, the relationships you cherish, they're fragile. They require trust. And once trust is broken through deliberate deception, it's nearly impossible to fully repair. Richard Halstead wanted to know the truth about his family. He discovered they were flawed, selfish at times, capable of celebrating his absence. But he also discovered that he was the most flawed of all, willing to sacrifice everything for certainty, unable to risk the vulnerability that might have created genuine connection. His family was relieved by his incapacity, but he engineered the situation specifically to reveal their relief, then used it to justify his sense of being unloved. It's a tragedy with no heroes, just wounded people wounding each other until the damage became irreparable. The lesson isn't that Richard's family was perfect or that their responses were admirable. The lesson is that testing people without their knowledge is a form of betrayal they can't unknow, can't forgive, can't move past. Relationships require trust. Richard destroyed his family's trust to gain truth. And truth without trust is just loneliness with documentation. If the story moved you, if it made you think about your own relationships differently, if it reminded you that trust is precious and deception is corrosive, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment below telling us what you would have done. Would you forgive someone like Richard? Could you move past such profound betrayal? How would you have responded if you were Michael, Eleanor, or Claire? We read every comment, and your perspectives create meaningful conversations in our community. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss our upcoming stories about real human experiences that challenge how we think about family, trust, and what we owe each other. Thank you for staying with us through this difficult journey. Thank you for engaging with questions that don't have easy answers. Until next time, remember, the people you love deserve your honesty, not your testing. They deserve your vulnerability, not your surveillance. Choose connection over control. Choose trust over certainty. Because in the end, being right about people's flaws while losing them completely is the loneliest kind of victory. Take care of yourselves and the people you love.